This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg. Our podcast and YouTube channel, Spirit Matters, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. You can go to YouTube and just type in 3 words, Spirit Matters Talk. A couple of things before we start today. Please subscribe, whether you're listening as a podcast or YouTube channel. It's a little red button you can click and subscribe. And I want to thank those people that have contributed to help keep us on the air. We are not a nonprofit, but you can support us by contributing, and that information is all found at spiritmatterstalk.com. Very excited to have back on our show today Amanda Lucia. She is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of California-Riverside and the author of Reflections of Amma, Devotees in a Global Embrace. We went into that in detail last interview. This time, her new book, and I'm going to hold it up, White Utopias, which I stayed up last night reading, and subtitled The Religious Exoticism of Transformational Festivals. Fascinating stuff, and something I know most of our listeners will be interested in. So thank you so very much for taking the time to come on with us today, Amanda.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here, and thanks for allowing me to be present with you. I appreciate it.
We should apologize to the viewers that I had computer problems, and so the video my video may not be as clear, but as long as you hear me, we're fine. Amanda, this topic of your new book, which is published by University of California Press?
Yeah.
Tell us what got you interested in this subject and how you went about your research.
Well, thanks for that. Certainly, what's interesting about this book is I started off without really the intention to have the book go in the direction that it did. And it started off because I moved here to Southern California, and I had probably recently read Phil's book, right? American Veda, talking about all of the richness of the Bhakti scene and in Southern California, US more generally, but particularly here. And I went out to Bhakti Fest in the desert. And with the first project that I worked on with Amma Devotees, I had already had a lot of experience with non-Indian or primarily white New Age devotees, but then here I found that the field was not as comprised of kind of people who had imagined themselves to have made a life change. I don't like to use the word conversion necessarily, but somebody who had only kind of recently gotten into the scene. Whereas here I found there were some fairly deep roots to non-Indians who were interested in following and bhaktas and devotees of their own yogic practice, their own religious practice. And I wanted to know more about those communities, what they were doing, how they were founded, how they identified themselves and understood themselves in relationship to South Asian traditions, South Asian religious traditions. And the book kind of took off from there, trying to understand what they thought they were doing, how they imagined themselves, and then also why they were culling from such a specific demographic community, primarily educated, often urban dwelling, often, at least, I saw the wealth broken up a little bit, so we can talk more about that if we want, but oftentimes from either kind of lineage wealth or, well, doing well themselves. They weren't worried about their paychecks every month necessarily. And then predominantly white. And it was so interesting to me because in some other places of the United States, it's a little bit less stark because those populations or those states might be more predominantly white. But here in California, where it's only 37% white, it's very rare actually to go into a fully white space. Even the country clubs are not fully white, or the places you might imagine to be kind of white spaces are not usually homogenously white. But some of these festivals were. Not only, but, some, as I speak in the book, around 77 or 80% white, all the way up to what I would say is, almost homogeneously white, 95 to 100% white space.
I'm curious, when you came to, when you started researching for your book, I'm sure you had many preconceived notions about what you would find and what you would write about. What came up in your research, if anything, that surprised you?
Well, I kind of, I had been aware of scholarly trends in the field that identified kind of the root of these scenes, for lack of a better word, as superficial, as capitalistic, as intentionally harmful, right? There's a lot of kind of negative talk about the New Age scene in general, in academia, but then also I think among the general populace, when you say, like, even this phrase, like the woo-woo people, right? They're kind of the butt of a joke sometimes. And I was always kind of working in contrast to that misrepresentation, is how I see it. And then I think that was really my hunch going in the field. And then it was really solidified by the people I met, who were in fact very earnest, very serious, for the most part, very dedicated, very much searching for alternative life ways and life worlds, in resistance to what they saw as kind of the world as it exists around us. I think there's a really, one of the things I try to highlight in the book is that there's a really heavy critique at the center of a lot of these turns to the other or turns toward the exotic. And I think that critique, we can argue about whether it is actualized, manifested, useful, put into practice, political. We can argue about what that critique is and whether it's effective, but it's certainly there. I think it's most definitely there. And people are looking to alternative life ways to become different and to shape different worlds. And so I felt like that was kind of my hunch, but then really reinforced by the field.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you said that, Amanda, because in my experience, the people that are dismissed often as dilettantes or woo-woo types, the spiritual but not religious cohort in general, I think is not taken seriously enough. Speaking of which, you focus on that SBNR, spiritual but not religious population who attends these festivals. I'm curious if you've looked at the data, and the data I've seen seems to indicate this fast-growing category of people who are unaffiliated with any religious or tradition, the nuns. And it's not clear to me what percentage of those people are spiritual but not religious, and as opposed to just totally disconnected from anything spiritual. Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, I appreciate that comment, and those two categories are oftentimes conflated, right?
Yeah.
The spiritual but not religious and the nuns, and I'm sure I do a bit of that as well, unwittingly. The nuns, of course, NONES, comes from the Pew Forum, the census, right? When asked, what religion are you? The people who check the box, none. Spiritual but not religious is an analytical category, but it's also something that I found that a lot of people self-identify as in these fields. And I think one of the differences is that I found coming up again and again in my interviews was just how often the people who identify as spiritual but not religious are in fact anti-religious. They're kind of sometimes very aggressively anti-religious. They think religion has created a lot of problems in our world, that it is a source of corruption and greed and abuse. And sometimes there's a conflation, their critique between religion and Christianity. I would say I was really surprised at that, how often religion I felt like was almost like a stand-in term for Christianity or for the Catholic Church. Oftentimes, people who had suffered and felt that they had suffered in very oppressive, as they viewed it, upbringings, religious upbringings.
Could I just I want to ask The people that were against religion strongly, but spiritual, but not religious, did they, most of those people categorize themselves as being atheist or not?
No, they would say spiritual. I would say that's where I would get that term spiritual, but not religious. So they would kind of tell me stories of how religion had created harm in their life, and then how they were exploring in what tended to be non-Christian, I would say religious fields, but they thought spiritual fields, whether it be like guru devotion or ritualism or meditation or whatever kind of other form that they were looking through for inspiration. And I think that is a distinctive feature of the SBNR community, as opposed to the people who are none, who might identify as none or write that on the census, who might just kind of have an ambivalent or, you know, they don't tend to think too much or care too much about religion. So I think that might be one distinction.
But is there, in terms of data, are there any studies that have a reliable indication of the numbers of SBNRs as opposed to the number of nuns?
Not to my knowledge. No, I think that the census data is gathered according to nuns, and we can have figures for how those nuns are on the rise. You know, I think that's the headline of what was it? I don't want to misname, but I think it's 2009 Pew Forum, right? Nuns on the rise. But then SBNR, I think in that you could look more closely at the Pew forum on nuns, and they have it broken down into spiritual, agnostic, atheistic. So get into those weeds there and it'll tell you.
Okay.
In your book, you talk about these events, these festivals, Burning Man, Lightning in a Bottle, Bhakti Fest, Wanderlust. And I think any of us that have attended any of those or any festivals like those, they're predominantly white, just like yoga classes are predominantly white. When I go to any spiritual group, it's predominantly white. But I have to say, a few years ago, I was in Southern California, and I went to a Hare Krishna center to, they have a festival, a feast one day. I don't think it was on a Sunday night, and I'll do that there. Their food is very good and it's very friendly. I like the feeling there. People are very friendly. And I went and I went a few times, and it was predominantly Indian, not white. And I was really surprised. And then I thought to myself, why should I was shocked that I was surprised. Why should I be surprised? This is, you know, this is the tradition, and there were many Indians in that area. Is that becoming more the case, or is that an isolated incident? Because I haven't experienced that a lot. But at the Hare Krishna temple at this particular location, there was a very strong Indian population. And when I spoke to the, they didn't represent the whole group, but I spoke to a few Indians that were there. It was, they saw it as a Bhakti temple, and didn't think of it so much as a Hare Krishna temple, like like I would have. And they had a sort of a different perception of it, but they were very active there, and it was a lot of fun, and it was great, and it was much more diverse than I had experienced. Is that a trend, or is that just an isolated incident?
Yeah, I think that's honestly what sparked my interest, was because working in the Amma community, it was certainly at least half South Asian everywhere I went, if not more sometimes.
Even throughout the US?
Yeah, even in the US. I mean, of course, there's some places that were whiter than others, but mostly due to the demographic of that particular place. But if you went to Detroit or Toronto or Boston or Chicago, any of those cities, there was a pretty significant South Asian population that would come to see Amma. And the Hare Krishnas, in fact, you know, and this is a kind of longer story that we can't get into, have turned toward, and the South Asian community and South Asian in diaspora have turned toward the Hare Krishnas as a kind of home temple in some sense, you know, even since I would say since the 90s, 2000s, when some of the scandals broke with the Hare Krishnas, they kind of lost a lot of their non-Indian populations, right as kind of diaspora Hindu communities were booming and Indian Hindus turned toward them. So Nicole Karapanagiotis, I hope I said her last name right, just wrote a book called Branding Bhakti. Claire Robeson, some of the other people who have been working on the Hare Krishnas for a long time have talked a lot about the kind of South Asian turn in the Hare Krishnas, both in India as well as in other places outside of India.
I also to add, I'm here in Fairfield, Iowa, where Maharishi University is, and I was on the faculty there years ago. And right now, I mean, the university, the undergraduate and graduate population is predominantly non-white. A lot of Africa, different areas of Asia, a lot of Indian and Chinese. And so interesting, you know, some of those students may have come specifically for spiritual reasons. Some of them may have come because they have programs in computer science and accounting that are very much job related, but it has become way more diverse than it was, say, in the 70s and 80s when it was, 90%, 95% white.
But I don't think that pertains to Amanda's research, Dennis, because they're international recruits to a college.
Not entirely. Amongst the undergraduate population, there's a lot of non-white who are from the United States. Yeah. With the graduate students, I would say yes. Yeah.
That's what makes it so interesting, I feel like, because so many of these other spaces and really the kind of more rigorous, I would say, devotional spaces are oftentimes very much influenced by India, South Asia, Indian Hindu people and things. Whereas I found in these spaces, they were much more kind of holdouts of white homogeneity than I thought that they would be. And their engagement with India and Hinduism was much more about texts and things and not so much about people and culture. So that was quite striking to me, and that's what the book kind of came to be.
Amanda, you focused on festivals. I've been to some of them. I've never been to Burning Man, but I've been to Bhakti Fest and a few of the other Bhakti-oriented ones. And in my memory, you're quite right. It's not 100% white, but it's predominantly white. How do you account for that? Is it something about the nature of these festivals and their locations, the kind of outreach they do? Why is it so? Why is there not more diversity?
I think that's a big question, but I do try to, like, that's the point of the book, right? And so I try to take a hand at it. I think there's both attraction and detraction factors that are happening. So the attraction factors, which is why are white people going, right? Why are they attracted to these spaces? I think is in part because of this kind of performative and playful exploration of other religious fields, of other religious cultures that happens there. And that's what I talk about through the term religious exoticism and that's in the title of the book, right? The religious exoticism of transformational festivals. And the ways in which that kind of exploration turns into a form of play that is exploratory and liberating, but is also a bit possessive and experiential, but really focused on the individual's experience and much less on any kind of allegiance or solidarity or demand for partnership with the community that has produced that, whatever it is, whether it's a Tibetan singing bowl or a crystal skull or a yoga class or a Vedic ritual. And that becomes, I think, a perpetuating factor. So when those people are in those fields, occupying that space of representation and possession, I think it also serves as a deterrent to people who look at those fields and say, that field is not for me. So I think in some sense, there's an idea of like whiteness. I use Arun Saldana's work on the viscosity or the stickiness of whiteness. Like it becomes a thick barrier for others. So when they see that all together, people of color might look at that festival and say, that's not something I want to engage in, or that's not a space for me. Or they may even have a critique like, they are misrepresenting my culture, or where are the South Asians, or why am I not represented in that space, even though they're performing practices that are from my heritage. So that's the main prong that I think through. Now, of course, there's other economic factors like leisure time, the idea of health inequities, right? If yoga is about health, there are, as we've seen so desperately during COVID, health inequities are extraordinarily real in our country. And of course, not everyone feels that they have access to good health care, the ability to spend time on wellness and self-care, which has become such a buzzword as well, right? I get a little bit concerned about that last economic argument, though, because it is kind of an assumption that people of color don't have the means or the self-interest in caring for themselves to attend, which is certainly not the case, right? We have all kinds of events and things that people of color spend money on, and big money on, in this country that are not these festivals. So the kind of interesting question is to wonder, why not here and why somewhere else?
If I may, it's almost, you could argue the reverse, because at least some of the festivals I've been to, the accommodations are pretty funky. And you have to be young and adventurous, really, to want to go spend 3-4 days in, like Bhakti Fest in the desert heat and funky accommodations. And maybe that has something to do with it.
Yeah.
No, I think there's oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think there's also a history of, camping and environmentalism and nature. Like if you look at the statistics on the national parks, they are not great either, even in a state like California, that is so highly diverse. So I think that has everything to do with it.
Yeah. It's fascinating what you're bringing out. And again, I'm going to mention to our listeners the title of the book, White Utopias. Even within Christianity in America, you go from church to church, there's very little racial diversity, even though probably a very large percentage of African Americans would categorize themselves as being Christian. They're not found in the same churches generally as white Christians. So there's that discrimination there, or not discrimination necessarily, but that aversion. There's a reason. And now you could say, maybe because it goes by neighborhood to neighborhood. But I think when an environment is predominantly white, there might be not as attractive. Just like if an environment is predominantly African American or something, maybe white people won't venture into it as much. So these are barriers that would be, you think, at this point in the evolution of our culture, would have been done away with, but that doesn't seem to be happening. And for me, having grown up in a civil rights movement, it's very frustrating and disappointing that we exist as we exist with that separateness. But I think your book goes into it, and very thought-provoking, and has made me think about it a lot more. But answers I don't have, but certainly something I'd like to think about more, and also discuss with people from different ethnic and racial backgrounds. And because I think ultimately spirituality, whether it's under the umbrella of religion or spiritual but not religious and all, should be bringing various groups together and not being symbols of why and how they're apart.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I always remember, since we just passed Martin Luther King Jr.'s commemoration and birthday, that he said 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America.
Right.
That famous quote.
Right.
And it is true that even today, that the statistics on what we might call multi-ethnic congregations are quite low. There's some movement happening there in the megachurch world. I think some of those are becoming much more multi-ethnic, places like Harvest or Calvary, right? Those kinds of big churches that bring in tens of thousands of people on a Sunday. But yeah, also it's not only that these spaces were white only, but it was kind of that the whole purpose of some of these spaces was to explore the practice of non-white religious traditions.
Right.
And so, you know, I thought that was so strange, honestly, at the beginning.
Yeah.
That was kind of the beginning of my
You would
interest
have
in
never
it.
guessed that would have happened.
Right. If you really wanted to learn about any Asian religion or any indigenous religion or practice or cultural form, it seems like the people of that tradition would be really important to doing so.
And I'm sure, you know, most of the people who go to places like Bhakti Fest would be happy to see more of those people, but you know, they're just showing up, which brings me to another question. In your experience, it seems to me that one of the downsides or challenges of the spiritual but not religious, this whole spiritual independence phenomenon is, by definition, practically an absence of community. So do you see attendance at these festivals as some, you know, at least in part, an attempt to, you know, have a spiritual community, even on a temporary basis? And a corollary or an associated question would be, when I've gone to them, it's hard for me to distinguish how many of the people there are really serious about their spiritual lives and wanting to, you know, go deep, and how many are there, you know, to have a good time and, you know, meet their soulmate or, you know, whatever. Do you have a sense of those things?
Yeah, you have so many great questions in there. I want to try to remember them all. As far as, let me take the last to the first, and you'll help me remind me if I miss one of them. But how many people are serious? I think it depends on the festival, completely. And there's a wide diversity of festivals that I talk about in the book. And of course, we just had an article that came out yesterday, Burning Man, again, reiterating that it is not a festival. So it likes to imagine itself as not a festival, as a city, and really to dissociate from that category, especially as festivals become big money-making kind of red solo cup events with a huge environmental impact. They want nothing to do with that genre. I found Wanderlust is oftentimes kind of scoffed aside as the indulgent of the super rich, but the yoga was the hardest at Wanderlust festivals, the most rigorous, the most, in some ways, South Asian Sanskrit practice connected of all the festivals, which was kind of interesting to me. Also, the most yoga teachers and most yoga aficionados were at the Wanderlust festivals. And, you know, maybe they teach at athletic oriented studios. I don't know. But I think a lot of them were very much into furthering their practice and really serious about it. So kind of bucking that assumption a little bit. And similarly with, I think, Bhakti and Shakti festas, you get a lot of devotees. Yeah. A lot of people who have a really serious and, you know, devoted religious practice, even if it's amalgamated between Hinduism, Buddhism, and some kind of generalizable native something that they've put together for themselves. They're serious about what they're doing. And then, of course, there were people who were even more so, who had, you know, maybe been raised as a Hare Krishna, been raised in TM, been raised in Yogananda, Self-Realization Fellowship. That contingency is very much there in that field. So it's kind of hard to say. Tell me one more. Give me one more.
About the attempt to sort of build
community. Yeah, I mean, that's the most common word issued in these spaces. I think that is absolutely the reason why people are putting on these events at all, is to bring people together and to try to foster some sense of community. I think it's largely successful. People do build friendships and relationships and finding their soulmate. There's nothing wrong with that at these kind of events. But I think it does show that, you know, maybe the literary turn in the New Age community that happened somewhere around 1980s, where people, or maybe even earlier with Be Here Now, when people thought, I don't need to go to India, I don't need to find a guru, I can just read a book. That made it really individualistic. I mean, it made it kind of Protestant reminiscent as well, right? That you're going to find the answers in a book. But it meant that a lot of people were spiritually seeking on their own with a library. And that also kind of has impacted demographics and how this whole kind of turn toward the East or toward the exotic or toward the spiritual has proceeded in the last 40 or 50 years, I think.
Excuse me, I'm curious. You teach religious studies at University of California-Riverside. Your classes, how ethnically, how racially diverse are they? And does it reflect the diversity of the undergraduate population overall, or do you find your classes are more white or less white than the overall population of the campus?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking it. So at UCR, this is one of the things that actually made me start to think about it. I talk about that a little bit in the acknowledgements, that UCR is, I think, 80% non-white. And I found that my kind of assumptions when I came on as faculty in 2011 were that people thought that India was cool and they thought that New Age stuff was cool, and my classes would fill in a heartbeat the way they had at other places that I had taught. And it kind of wasn't the case. My students took my classes because they needed the credits, but they came in with this kind of like, why should I care about this attitude, or even a grumpy attitude, like this is for privileged white folks and it has nothing to do with my life. And, you know, I'm not necessarily all that interested in it, or you have to kind of dispel that assumption in my mind before you can show me why yoga is cool and interesting and not just something that's for other people and not my community. So that was one of the kind of oh geez moments, I would say, where I'm like, where I thought to myself, okay, I really need to reevaluate my assumptions about my field, and to look at the demographics and to think more carefully about why this is actually a point of aversion instead of attraction for some of my students.
Very interesting. How can I phrase this? The term you use, religious exoticism, for people who haven't heard that term, can you define it? And is it usually used as a kind of pejorative, or is it just a neutral term?
Well, I can certainly define it, and I'll do that part first. And I think the pejorative question is an interesting question. So exoticism comes from a kind of long history. In fact, some of the terms like exoticism and appropriation, we think that they're kind of like pop in vogue terms right now, but they have a long history in the colonial archive of appropriating wealth and culture and resources in the colonial period, as well as the exoticism that was evident in early travel logs, 15th century, 16th century, as soon as we had kind of European exploration and dominance outside of Europe. So the terms are old. Exoticism essentially refers to the attraction to the other, to alterity, but not necessarily with a lot of substantive knowledge or relationship with the other. So you can be attracted to something simply because it's other. And it's used oftentimes in thinking through Orientalism. But I didn't want to use the term Orientalism because here we have attraction to alterity when it's not of the Orient, right? When it's of indigenous cultures, or simply not this, right? Not this kind of hyper-Western capitalist modernity that we're in, something else. So it could be primitive tool making, right? It's an exoticization of, okay, I'm dissatisfied with whatever my current kind of locus is, so I'm going to look elsewhere to the other and romanticize that, right? And find that to be the solution to the problem of the present. So that's where the definitional part of the term is. And I don't think that it's an insult necessarily, but I don't think that it is something to aspire to. How about that? I think that we have to be very careful, because in the activity of exoticism, you lose the people, you lose the human, you lose the relationship that would actually form a kind of substantive partnership of exchange. And so in contrast to exoticism, I think through a little bit with Leela Gandhi and her work on the politics of friendship, like what would it actually mean, instead of just reading a book about yoga and you know, adopting a Hindu ritual, to make friends, to develop a relationship with the human aspect of those cultures. And I think what you would find is that it would immediately diversify the experience, right? Because you would have, when you're interacting with humans, you have lots of different perspectives, and it would poke holes in the exoticist fantasy. Mm-hmm. So it is very difficult to say something like, oh, India is so spiritual when you're talking to a computer programmer.
Or you go to India.
Or you go to India. Yeah, like,
I didn't know it, yeah.
So once you build a human relationship, it thwarts the kind of stereotyping that exoticism allows, and even enables.
I have one final question, then I'll turn it over to Phil. In writing your book and researching for your book, White Utopias, did you come across anything that, or even after writing it, where you thought, okay, this is where I'm going with my next book?
I feel like there was so much that I could have talked about that I didn't have time to talk about. And I tried to solve that in some sense with the little interludes. I put 4 or 5 interludes that are 3 or 4 pages of just like, here's my thought on this. And I don't have a chance to think about it for the entire book. One of those recently, I'm turning into an article, one on beauty. There's a very hilarious and almost, you know, humbling interlude about me getting a sty, you know, like an eye infection on the way to a New Zealand yoga festival, a Wanderlust in New Zealand. And that was mortifying. And I realized how attached I was to my own beauty image and my own ego. And now I was interviewing all these beautiful yogis who, with their cascading tresses looking like they just came out of a commercial, and I felt gross. And so it really helped me to think about how we are relating yoga and beauty and morality and goodness all together. So I'm working on an article that came out of that. And there's some other things that I think are pieces of new work that I will pick up in the future, but that's the first thing that comes to mind.
Great.
So as long as we're on the future, one quick question as a preview for what I hope will be your next visit with us. Your bio says you're working on a study of the media representation of gurus. Tell us quickly what you're up to with that.
So this is part of a large project that I'm the principal investigator for, which is a large grant that we received to study religion and sexual abuse. And this is across all religious traditions. And we have a partnership of about 15 different scholars. We have a conference coming up at UC Riverside, which is very exciting. March 4th through 6th. And you can check out our website at religionandsexualabuseproject.org. And I can throw that in the chat at some point. But my role in that is about media representations of gurus. I mean, we know that so many gurus are involved in scandal. So many gurus are dragged through the media for scandal, for nefarious behavior of all different kinds. And so I'm trying to understand why that is, and how long that's been happening for. And I think it's quite a bit longer than we think. We tend to think of this as like, oh, dystopian modernity. Actually,
No, I can show you articles from over 100 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. And even further, if you go into the role of the yogi, the role of the fakir, the role of the sannyasi in the colonial archive was also kind of a liminal and dangerous sexualized figure. So I'm ambitiously thinking through a long project on representation, and we'll see how far I get with that. But I'm going to be at the British Library in London on sabbatical next year, which I'm very excited about, and I'll be able to dive deep and
Great.
pay attention.
Great. Well, Amanda, thank you so much for being with us. I look forward to what you come up with in that area, because I've had to do my own research on that. There's the book, a fabulous cover. White.
Yeah, and it's a well-researched book. It's very thought-provoking. And it's not a quick read because I read it quickly last night, but I'll go back and read it more in a slower fashion. But for me, there's so many things in that book that stirred my interest and thoughts, and I had more questions about. So I highly recommend it, and great work.
And I'll say from the professional writer perspective that not every academic writes for a university press as well as Amanda does. So you can read this without too much struggle.
I try to be readable. Thank you. I appreciate that. That's a high compliment indeed.
Thanks for being with us, Amanda.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invitation. I appreciate it.
That was Amanda Lucia, back on the show. Her new book here, White Utopias, the religious exoticism of transformational festivals. It's fascinating subject matter. And like you said, we discussed this after the interview. She's an academic. She was published by an academic press, but unlike some academic books that are not so easily absorbable by the general public, this one was, but it was very well researched and done and very thought-provoking.
Yeah. I've been to I've never been to Burning Man. One of the things I want to look into her book about is, I always thought Burning Man was a very different thing from the, Bhakti Fest and Shakti Fest and Wanderlust. But she's obviously found some interesting overlap in those things. They were, right. And they would have things in common.
I watched a documentary on Burning Man a couple of years ago, and after watching it, it was different than I expected it to be, and I'd wished I had gone. Yeah. Now I'm probably not going to go now, but it's like
not very appealing in COVID times.
Yeah, but. Yeah, it's. But it's an amazing sense of creativity. It's festive, and like she said, if you interview people that have been to it, spirituality is a big part of it. Even I think if they go there without that intention, when you get a group of people coming together for festivals, for celebration, spirituality is in the air. Spirituality is there for folks, and even if they're not looking at it, they might find it. So that was interesting. But I think also what she was discussing this about the whiteness, you go to a yoga class, you go to a meditation center, it's how white it is. And why is that? And certainly it's not 100% the case, but it also reflects the underpinnings of our culture and how we're set up. And we're taping this, we taped it right around Martin Luther King Day in 2022. And as you did, Phil, we grew up in the civil rights movement during that time of Martin Luther King. And it's sad that things didn't progress at the rate that we would hope they progress at in terms of what Martin Luther King's desires and wishes and, the collective wishes of I think the majority of the people were. So, but I think, we're still moving in we'll continue to move in that direction.
Well, but I think, we have progressed a lot. I mean,
right.
It's curious why these kind of festivals and yoga classes and a lot of the meditation centers.
And churches.
Well, the churches tend to be neighborhood, or you belong
Right.
to this, you
Right.
follow this, sect and not that one. But the, places where people come together from in an urban setting, they're not segregated by neighborhoods or the church you grew up in or whatever. But one of the differences between now and 50, 80 years ago is the participants who go to the festivals or to the yoga centers or whatever, they're not intentionally segregating these places. They would welcome people of color and be very, happy to see them. And for
But there's a reason why people of color don't feel comfortable going into those spaces.
I get it,
Yeah.
but it's not intentional segregation, right. And it's not, so it's, right. It's different, but right. Yet it still falls out that way in these cases. And we've had other people on the show talking about this. We talked about it in the American Buddhist community and in, the yoga world. And it's an interesting phenomenon. And right. I don't think
it is an interesting phenomenon because like, for instance, we know folks from the David Lynch Foundation, and they bring TM into a lot of schools in urban areas that are predominantly kids of color. And it's tremendous reception for that in those areas. And so it's not like it appeals just more to white folks than people that are not white. But for whatever reason, these organizations, these groups, these festivals tend to have that whiteness that she talks about in the book.
You're right. And, I know there are people who bring yoga into inner city areas and ethnically diverse areas. Go back 50 years, we had friends who were bringing TM into the Black community. And
there was the TM movement, Transcendental Meditation Movement, had a separate organization specifically run by African Americans going into those into home communities, but ultimately bringing everybody together. I think was the idea.
But it was recognized that people from some neighborhoods are not going to go to that the other neighborhood, so we'll bring this to them. And you're right, the reception is always
and also I think. And it's not just color, it's also economic situation, because there's cost involved in yoga classes and meditation classes.
That's right.
So if you were to interview the people that participate in these festivals, in these classes, you're going to find that their income is going to be, middle to upper income.
Yeah. Also true. In any event, it's fascinating. And after COVID ends, I will, next time I go to one of these, I'll read Amanda's book before I go and have a different orientation.
Then we will interview you about your reactions.
Well, but the other thing is the presence in some of the organizations, like you mentioned, how many people of Indian descent are at the Hare Krishna places you went. And
some of them, not all of them, yeah.
I know, I've gotten to know an awful lot of people in the Indian American community. And when they come here, when people immigrate to America, they do what other immigrant groups have done throughout American history, is eventually they'll build a house of worship. That's why we have synagogues and mosques and, Catholic churches over time. And so now there are Hindu temples all over the country, but sometimes it's more convenient for people to just go to the Hare Krishna temple and do some kirtan, or to the Vedanta Society, if they're more comfortable with that
Right.
form of engagement. So you see more integration of South Asian people and white Americans in some of those local things probably than what Amanda, because you have to make a big effort to go to a festival.
Right.
So
A big, and as you pointed out before, the accommodations aren't always terribly comfortable. Terribly is maybe a good word. Yeah. Terribly comfortable is always so I mean, like Burning Man, many stories. And then people complain now because wealthy folks come and they have, bring all the accommodations in a trailer and they helicopter in or whatever. And a lot of folks feel that takes away.
It's like when you go to the big festivals, the Kumbh Mela in India, where, you'll see
the festival of all festivals.
That's the Maha festival. And when you go to those, you see, people, ordinary, Indian people coming from villages hundreds and hundreds of miles away, hanging onto trucks and stuff, and they're sleeping on the ground. And you see a lot of Westerners either in a nearby hotel or in the deluxe tents that are set up, with good food and stuff. So you're always going to see those kind of disparities.
Right.
So,
except at Woodstock, I don't think there were any luxury tents.
That's a good point. But it's very white, except for the entertainers. Okay.
Well, till next time, Phil. Great show. And again, let me hold up the book.
White Utopias.
Great. All right.
See ya.
And please subscribe.
Subscribe.
If you want to send in some, you want to help keep us going, go to spiritmatterstalk.com and it'll explain how you can contribute to help us and keep our archives open and free to the public.
Subscribing costs nothing.
Nothing. Just click.
But it's good for us to have a number of subscribers, so maybe we'll be able eventually to attract sponsors. So
there you go.
Please hit that button.
All right.
Thanks.
Next time.